Tonight on Nation and Nation, the federal government seeks a judicial review of its $20 billion child welfare settlement and says the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal is overturning a negotiated deal.
The compensation regime that was planned and presented in the final settlement agreement was designed by First Nations people.
Also, the feds halted the huge expansion of a mine in Nunavut. The Minister of Northern Affairs explains why.
It has to be done in a way that is not harmful to the environment and respects Indigenous Inuit rights holders.
And lastly, according to the government, the rising shortage of children's medications has not hit First Nations yet.
We currently actually feel that we're in a good position relative to these medications within the remote and isolated communities.
Welcome to Nation and Nation. I'm Fraser Needham. Earlier this year, the federal government reached a $20 billion settlement agreement with the Assembly of First Nations and other parties to compensate on-reserve First Nations children and their families, shortchanged by a chronically underfunded child welfare system. However, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal says the agreement does not meet all the requirements of its 2019 ruling. The government has now asked for a judicial review of the tribunal's latest findings. This is what the Indigenous Services Minister had to say in a press conference yesterday.
We'll continue, as I said, to work with the parties. Our first priority is to ensure compensation can unfold quickly for those that the court agrees, the tribunal agrees the agreement covers well, and we will ask the federal court to review the remainder of the decision.
Joining us today to talk about this is Minister of Indigenous Services, Patty Hajdu. Minister Hajdu, welcome to Nation and Nation.
Thanks for having me on.
Right, now I noticed you had this press conference yesterday about the judicial review, and you have said a number of times that you want to start flowing this money, obviously, as quickly as possible. So why not just maybe listen to what the CHRT has to say and just start flowing the money?
Well, that is actually the plan, where two things can be true. So we have an agreement with the parties that we will begin to compensate, and we're on a path to figuring out how to do that right now for children that were systemically discriminated and harmed through a systemically racist policy and approach. But there are questions, in fact, that AFN also has around the CHRT's decision. There's also a deadline to file a judicial review 30 days after a decision. So we took this move so that we could, first of all, have time to get the entire decision from the CHRT. We don't only have the summary decision. But secondly, to ask some important questions of the federal court around really a historic agreement, a final settlement agreement that was Indigenous-led and supported by all the parties. So I'm confident that we have a good foundation for the beginning of the compensation process, but I think these questions are important to ask the court.
Right, and I guess I just want to ask you a bit specifically about that. What is it you exactly want the courts to review about the CHRT's latest statement, I guess, and what do you hope they find?
Well, I think, our lawyers have questions around the decision, the summary decision, as I said, that overturns really an agreement that is historic, that was negotiated with Indigenous people. The compensation regime that was planned and presented in the final settlement agreement was designed by First Nations people. And it had the full support of all the parties that were litigating. And so this is an unusual space. Usually, I'm no lawyer, but my understanding is that courts appreciate when parties work out a solution together. And so the question, one of the questions that's in our statement or our request for judicial review is around a decision by the tribunal that would overturn this collaborative approach with the government and the parties involved. And I will say this, a lot of work went into that final settlement agreement. I think Canadians know that, and Indigenous First Nations people know that. It took well over a year to get there. It was meticulously thought through by especially the First Nations partners, who had a very specific view about how compensation should flow. And it is, in some ways, well, it is historic, because it is the compensation approach is designed by First Nations people. So, there's a lot there to work with. The government is still firmly committed to compensating children who were harmed, and indeed, as I said, we'll be working with the parties on how we begin that compensation as soon as possible and finding that pathway.
Right, and I guess we've heard different numbers, but how many children and families roughly does this the agreement you have with the AFN and other parties cover?
Well, it covers thousands of children, and I don't have an exact number for you right now, but it's many, many children that were harmed. This action, this legal action, is a reflection of the kinds of discrimination that many First Nations people will tell you that they faced in their lives, and children being removed from homes through a system that oftentimes was penalizing poverty and other kinds of outcomes of colonization. And so it's thousands of people, children, we say children, but children that were harmed from for over 30 years through this system of discrimination.
Right, and I know that your agreement actually goes back further than the original CHRT. You're covering children and families back to 91. I think theirs started at 2006, so you've changed the parameters as you know. It seemed to be, maybe in some of your statements yesterday, maybe I'm off or that, but that is the belief that the federal government believes it's covering all the children that it was responsible for, but that perhaps CHRT has maybe found its response, that it's talking about children that weren't in the care of the federal government at that time, or not responsible, perhaps of the provinces. Is that the issue?
Well, there are some questions around those findings by those, I suppose, rulings by the CHRT. But primarily right now, the judicial review is focused on the legitimacy of the legal decision to not accept a negotiated agreement. And again, I go back to how historic this is and how transformational this will be for the families affected. Look, I think there are many, many ways that Indigenous people were discriminated against and are discriminated against, and the Government of Canada needs to lean in and to change those systems that are systemically discriminatory. But in this case, I am profoundly aware of the amount of work that went into this agreement by AFN, by Mashum and Trout and many others that contributed to ensuring that the compensation regime would be fair, that it would be sensitive, that it would not cause onward harm. And I really appreciated that, because although I wasn't a politician at the time, I was working in and amongst Indigenous communities when the settlements for residential schools started to unfold in this country. And for some people it was life-changing in a positive way, and for some people it was devastating. And the relitigation of trauma that some individuals had to go through in order to get independent assessment payments was extremely damaging. And so I, in my mind, remembered those stories and the people that I met that shared them with me, and I was profoundly grateful that it was Indigenous people, First Nations people, designing this package so that it would be safer for people trying to access compensation. And I know that seems odd, doesn't it? That getting compensation can cause harm, but it can cause harm if it's done in a way that's traumatizing and re-victimizing. And so I was very appreciative to the First Nations partners for taking the lead in that design.
Okay, fair enough. And if the courts do come back, though, and say that they actually agree CHRT is right and the government's wrong in its interpretation, will you go back to the negotiating table?
Yes, and in fact, I would say that we're always willing to work with the parties on a consensual approach to resolving differences. This has got to be the way forward for Canada. I mean, we've got to stop using the courts as a way to settle our disagreements, and I think that's why, although this came about because of legal action, I think that's why the settlement agreement is so historic, is that it was negotiated, it was agreed upon, all parties agreed with the approach. But having said that, always willing to sit down with the parties to find a consensual way through the questionable areas.
Does that include, though, opening up the compensation amount or going beyond the $20 billion?
Well, at this point, we're confident that the $20 billion will suffice. And but listen, I'm always interested in hearing non-litigant ways to get to an agreement that aren't that doesn't involve litigation. I think reconciliation is about trying to find a path forward together. I think what's should be an indication for your viewers and for the listeners of the seriousness of the government's intent, and I think the growing trust between the government and the parties is that, in fact, as you know, AFN has asked for a judicial review of this decision as well. I've made it very clear to Regional Chief Woodhouse that we'll continue to work together on not just how to flow this compensation for the areas that we agree, but how we get through these areas of uncertainty as well.
We'll have to leave it there, but once again, thanks for joining us today, Minister Hajdu.
Thank you very much.
We'll be right back after these messages with Minister of Northern Affairs, Dan Vandal. Welcome back. Last week, the federal government rejected a proposed expansion of Baffinland's Mary River mine on Baffin Island, Nunavut. The proposed expansion would have doubled the mine's output to 12 million tons of ore annually. It's also included a proposed construction of a 110-kilometer railway to the Milne Inlet port. Joining us today to talk about the government's decision is Minister of Northern Affairs Dan Vandal. Mr. Vandal, thanks. Welcome to Nation Nation.
Good to be here. Good.
So I guess we'll start off with the first question is, maybe you could outline some of the reasons why you sided with the Nunavut, Review Board and made the decision to stop the expansion.
Well, first of all, I think it's important to acknowledge that the Nunavut Impact Review Board, or NIRB, did a really comprehensive and lengthy analysis of the entire Baffinland Phase 2 expansion. I think it lasted something like over 3 years. And they studied it thoroughly from every possible angle. And their final recommendation was that the Phase 2 expansion had a high potential of creating severe adverse effects on marine mammals and fish, on the terrain around it, the flora, the fauna, and it would have a significant negative impact on Inuit harvesting, Inuit traditional Inuit hunting grounds, and Inuit way of life, and that the mitigation that was studied as part of that proposal was not, it was impossible to mitigate those negative effects. So that, of course, was weighed very, very heavily on my decision. The second reason was that Inuit rights holders, as per the Nunavut Agreement, the treaty land claims, the treaty land claims agreement, QIA, Kikitani Inuit Association, were not supportive. NTI, Nunavut Tungavik Inc., were not supportive as well. And that was very significant when the people on the land are not supportive of the expansion.
Right, and that's a balancing act, I guess, the government has to play, knowing that there's always concerns with the environment things. But at the same time, it is a very big employer in an area, and job creator in an area that desperately needs these things. Yeah. So how hard is that to make these decisions?
It's very difficult, and in fact. About 2 months ago, we worked very closely with Baffinland and with QIA to increase their iron ore production from 4.2 million per year to 6 million, and that was quite literally 2 months ago. This was a separate application. It was to go from 6 million to 12 million to double the capacity. And we understand the value of Baffinland, and we appreciate their contribution to the Nunavut economy over the last the duration of their investments. We understand that, but it's always, from the very beginning, we've tried to not only protect Nunavut jobs, but increase Nunavut jobs, while at the same time respecting the environment and the Inuit rights holders.
Okay, and so I'm going to move now for a minute to housing. Of course, that's a huge issue it's a huge issue everywhere in Canada, but particularly in northern Canada, Indigenous communities. Can you tell me a little bit about what the government is doing in terms of the Rapid Housing Initiative to help some of these people that are trying to get homes in the north?
First of all, it's important to say that in my time as Minister of Northern Affairs, which has been 3 years, housing is the issue that comes up the most often in all my consultations, my communications, my visits, whether they're in person or virtual. Housing is the #1 issue. We have a $70 billion housing plan through Minister Hussein that we are investing in many different programs. In fact, when I was up in Johaven over the summer, we saw a couple of sixplexes that were constructed in Johaven, which was incredibly positive. And budget 2022 actually is allocates approximately $4.4 billion over 5 years to invest in Indigenous distinctions-based housing. It's something that is fairly significant and something that's going to create a lot of housing units over the next 5 years. We are creating partnerships with the Nunavut government, with all 3 territorial governments, on developing more affordable housing for the North and the Arctic. And it's something we're committed to doing. We have made some real progress. There's some good projects out there. The problem is the gaps are so large, is that it's going to take a significant amount of time to actually close those gaps. So even though we're making great progress, there's some great projects out there. We have to continue doing this for many years.
Okay, well, we're going to have to end it there. But once again, thanks very much, Mr. Vandal, for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Thanks. After the break, we'll be joined by Indigenous Services Canada's Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Evan Adams, and Deputy Chief Nursing Officer, Leila Gillis. Welcome back. Reports of severe shortages of pediatric drugs, such as children's acetaminophen and ibuprofen, have hit the media in recent weeks. The Canadian government is working to rectify the problem, but concerns remain. Joining us today to talk about how these drug shortages may be affecting Indigenous communities are Dr. Evan Adams, Deputy Chief Medical Officer of Public Health for Indigenous Services Canada, and Leila Gillis, Deputy Chief Nursing Officer, also with Indigenous Services Canada. Dr. Adams and Ms. Gillis, welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Yes, very glad to talk on this.
Thank you. So we'll start with you, Dr. Adams. Can you tell our viewers why these extreme shortages of supply of pediatric drugs are happening in Canada right now?
Well, there are a number of supply issues, I think, across the country in many different areas, and I think there is some difficulties with the manufacturer meeting supply and demand at the current moment. I mean, I think we all know that there's a lot of illness that's happening amongst children, and so I guess there are pressures on supply. And we've been having conversations in anticipation of what we can do, looking at all of the different options to try and mitigate this need.
Ms. Gillis, how badly is the shortage affecting Northern and Indigenous communities?
Thanks, Fraser. My responsibility area with Indigenous Services Canada is for the remote and isolated nursing stations. So just those communities that you're talking about. We're monitoring it really closely. Drug shortages actually happen on occasion, and we monitor them really closely. We actually have for urgent and emergent care, so those really important services in remote communities delivered through the nursing stations, we actually have small pharmacies within our nursing stations where we maintain a certain number of medications and drugs to assure that we actually have the medication required to treat people who are ill in the community. And so we actually look at our inventory on a regular basis. We currently actually feel that we're in a good position relative to these medications within the remote and isolated communities, but we were working really closely with our actual on-site nurses and our pharmacists in the regions to make sure we're making sure we monitor the inventory, keep track of any pending shortages, and of course then we are working with our local pharmacies and of course our partners at Health Canada and others around replenishing and anticipating future shortages should they happen. But currently we're in a good situation where our staff actually have the supply they need to treat children in the remote nursing stations.
In many parts of Canada, children's hospitals and pediatric units are overflowing with children with respiratory ailments such as flu, COVID, or something else. Is this a trend that's happening in Northern First Nations as well?
Yeah, and I mean, I'll also turn to Evan as well, who really monitors the epidemiology of a lot of these diseases in community. But to the best of my knowledge and reporting from my team is that it actually is not quite to the same degree as we're seeing in some of the urban centers relative to COVID, flu, and I believe other things like RSV and other infections that are being reported on a regular basis within the hospitals that we're hearing on our local news. Certainly I'm here in unceded territory of the Algonquin people here in Ottawa, and we're hearing regularly about those increases. But Evan, I'm not sure whether from an epidemiology perspective, whether we have a sense of any sort of higher incidence within the First Nation communities for these in children.
Definitely we're getting signals that there is increased activity in RSV and COVID and flu in some First Nations and Métis communities, not all of them. I think at our last report, there were some of the chief medical officers saying that they were seeing increased activity in all three of those, all across the board, and others were saying they were only seeing some increases in some places. So I think we can safely say that this is a concern for all of us, and that we are, we're concerned about the population, and we're concerned about any prolonged shortages, which is why we're having conversations about what we can do if these shortages continue over a longer period than we're anticipating.
What maybe can some of these communities do if they're sort of in a crisis, worried about shortages of pediatric medications, but also maybe shortages of medical health professionals? Is there anything that they can do on their own just to ensure that their children are getting proper care?
You know, we're doing everything we can to assure that we have the medical professionals on site, certainly in remote communities where we have the direct service provision, to provide that service, and that we are working to assure that we have the medications required to be able to treat urgent and emergent care, to stabilize children should they require it, and of course all people in the community. And so I think that, from a parent's perspective, most importantly is to work towards prevention, to keep children at home if they're ill, and then, of course, seeking medical attention if they're concerned about their children. And we're doing everything we can to assure that the medical professionals and the medications required to treat urgent and emergent care are available for remote communities. And so, I would suggest those are some of the best advice I could provide.
Exactly. Well, we're going to have to end it there, but thanks to you both again for joining us today.
It's our pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
That concludes this week's episode of Nation and Nation. If you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcasts at aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Fraser Needham. Good night.